All right. Welcome everyone to the AI welfare seminars. This is the first event in the series. So today we have Jeff Sebo, Associate Professor of Environmental Studies, Director of the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, and Director of the Center for Mine Ethics and Policy at New York University. And he's going to present uh, on the next steps for AI welfare research. So let's get started.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Orpheus, for organizing this new speaker series and for inviting me to present, especially for the first session. I really appreciate that. And thanks everybody for being here. Looking forward to talking with you. And as we were discussing a moment ago, we can basically talk about whatever people would like to. We can take it wherever you would like to go. By default, we were thinking that it might be nice to selectively survey some next steps for AI welfare research and basically spotlight some questions in the sciences, in the social sciences, and then in governance, where we need to be focusing our attention in order to advance understanding of whether particular AI systems or digital minds might be conscious or agentic or otherwise morally significant, and what the public thinks about these issues, and then how those scientific and sociological realities might shape and constrain governance solutions around AI welfare. And so I thought that I would start by discussing some new questions and new ideas on, first of all, the AI welfare research side. So, using cognitive science and computer science to better understand whether AI systems might now or sometime soon be conscious, agentic, morally significant. Then spend a little bit of time discussing public attitudes and expert attitudes so that we can know what people think about this issue, and then finally discuss governance possibilities, what follows from the evidence and attitudes about how AI companies should be researching this issue, how they should be designing and deploying AI systems, and then also how governments should be responding and thinking about the legal and political status of AI systems. So, as a starting point, I see a question in the chat asking for a definition of AI welfare, and this is always a good place to start. So, when we talk about AI welfare, what we mean is broadly the same as what we mean by animal welfare. So the question here is, are AI systems now, or might they one day be, welfare subjects? In other words, entities capable of being benefited and harmed, made better off or worse off for their own sakes, from their own perspective. And obviously, philosophers and scientists and other experts disagree about, on the philosophical side, what it takes to be a welfare subject and to be the kind of entity who can be benefited and harmed. And then on the scientific side, which entities have the relevant capacities or stand in the relevant relationships. And so, for example, we generally debate, do you need to be sentient, capable of consciously experiencing positive and negative states like pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering, hope, fear, in order to be a welfare subject? Or is it enough to be robustly agentic, to have agency, to be able to set and pursue your own goals in a self-directed manner by acting on cognitive states like beliefs and desires and causal or instrumental reasoning, etc.? These are philosophical debates. And then on the science side, we likewise need to ask, in order to be sentient, in order to be able to consciously have positive, negative states like pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering, do you need to be made out of biology? Do you need to have a biological brain and body that is exactly like a human or mammalian or avian brain or body? Or is it enough to have any physical substrate that performs relevantly similar computational functions? These are, once again, live questions in the sciences. And so, to a certain extent, clarifying whether we should take seriously the possibility of AI systems as welfare subjects depends on philosophical progress and philosophical debate, but it also depends on scientific progress and scientific research. And one really exciting area of AI welfare research has been sharpening our understanding of the methodologies and tools available to us in the sciences. So, as an example, once people started taking AI welfare seriously a couple of years ago, which was, of course, a wonderful development, early discussions about the scientific study of AI consciousness and agency and welfare were unfortunately, especially in the public discourse, very simplistic and reductive in unhelpful ways and in both directions. On the one hand, there would be a lot of people expressing a high degree of confidence that AI systems have consciousness, sentience, agency, welfare, moral status, simply because their behavioral outputs are very impressive and very anthropomorphic. AI systems have the ability, especially language models, have the ability to mimic human behavior and to talk like us. And for many people, that itself seems like very strong evidence of AI consciousness, sentience, agency, welfare. And that, of course, seems a little bit too simplistic. And then on the flip side, there are a lot of people who have more skeptical perspectives and who think these AI systems were specifically trained to mimic human behavior by a simple pattern matching, text prediction, matrix multiplication method. And that is a kind of debunking explanation. It undercuts them having consciousness, sentience, agency, welfare. And I think both of these perspectives are too simple. The mere fact of impressive behavioral outputs is not proof or even particularly strong evidence of consciousness, for example, but neither is the availability of a debunking explanation a decisive refutation of AI consciousness. The only way we can make progress towards understanding the plausibility, the probability of AI systems as conscious beings, as sentient beings, as welfare subjects, is to collect different kinds of evidence and see where they converge. So, as an example, and I apologize if you hear sirens, New York City is always a loud place. As an example, in the study of animal minds, we have made a lot of progress towards understanding which animals have a high probability of being conscious sentient beings and which animals have at least a realistic probability of being conscious sentient beings. And this is not done through behavioral research alone, but is rather done through a bringing together of at least three different evidence streams: behavioral evidence, anatomical evidence, and evolutionary developmental evidence. So, yes, we do go and look at behaviors. We ask, do animals nurse their own wounds, and do they respond to analgesics and antidepressants like we do? Do they make behavioral trade offs between the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of other valuable goals? But we do not stop there. In addition to asking, do animals behave as though they suffer, we look underneath their behaviors and ask, do they have anatomical, physiological, neurobiological features that plausibly support the capacity to suffer? Do they have, for example, nociceptors, pain receptors? Do they have pathways carrying that information to the brain? Do they have systems for integrating information within the brain? Do they then have pathways for sending instructions back to the body? Those are internal mechanisms and structures that would plausibly support the ability to experience suffering and the connection between that and suffering relevant behavior. And then, moreover, we look at their developmental and evolutionary trajectories and we ask questions like, did they face environmental pressures that would plausibly be solved by the ability to suffer, by developing the ability to suffer? And when in their evolutionary history did this ability seemingly emerge? And then that might tell us something about how much we can extrapolate from known cases to less known cases on the evolutionary tree. We are just barely scratching the surface of looking for and bringing together different converging lines of evidence in the same kind of way in AI welfare research. And within the next several weeks, the Center for Mind Ethics and Policy, which I direct, and Elios AI Research will be following up our 2024 report, Taking AI Welfare Seriously, which made the basic case for taking AI welfare seriously as a research topic, following it up with a new report working paper called Studying AI Welfare Empirically. And this is going to lay out how we can look for functional analogs of behavioral, anatomical, and developmental evolutionary evidence in animals. We basically point out that in AI systems as well, you can, yes, of course, look for behavioral evidence, and that can be not only apparent self reports when AI systems appear to be reporting on their own internal states, but also behavioral observations, like looking at their behavioral preferences and seeing what their attractions and aversions are. So, yes, we can do functional analogs of animal behavior research, but then we can also do functional analogs of the anatomical research. We can do what we call internal research on AI systems. We can use interpretability to understand what is going on when they perform particular behaviors. We can do architectural research to understand what types of internals they have and what sorts of capabilities or dispositions can be predicted, can be made possible by those architectures. And then we can also do, and in fact, many people already do, developmental research. We can look at training methods, training data, training goals or objectives to understand under what pressures are AI systems placed during their training, and what can we predict from that about what kinds of capabilities or dispositions would emerge during training, and what the best explanation for those capabilities and dispositions are. You can also do trajectory research in the same kind of way that we can figure out when in our evolutionary history certain types of capabilities emerge for humans and other animals. You can also figure out when during the pre-training or post-training process certain types of capabilities emerge for AI systems. And that can once again give you a sense of how kind of fundamental those are, how widespread they might be within a model family, and how connected they might be with other relevant capabilities. And there are a lot of problems and epistemic gaps with AI welfare and consciousness research, as with animal welfare consciousness research. But there are also a lot of opportunities to overcome those gaps when you look at behavioral, internal, and developmental research together. For example, one of the main problems with behavioral research, as I noted a little while ago, is what some people call the gaming problem, what we might more broadly describe as the mismatch problem. The reality that when AI systems behave as though they can suffer, there are multiple explanations of that behavior available, some of which do not involve attributions of actual consciousness and sentience and suffering. Like they were trained on human language, including statements about the ability to suffer, and they were specifically post-trained in order to play a helpful assistant or portray other characters or personas that will often be portrayed as having various feelings and emotions. So this is a major obstacle with behavioral data, but we can partly manage this issue by combining behavioral data with internal and developmental data. Once an AI system not only behaves as though they can suffer, but also has internal architectural features that would plausibly support the ability to suffer, assuming that this is in principle possible in silicon, of course, and interpretability tools show that this is lighting up when they are expressing suffering. And when we go look at their developmental history and realize they were placed under pressures that would plausibly give rise to these capabilities and dispositions, that can help us understand what the best explanation of the behavior is. And then, as with animals, where we also have debunking explanations, it can help us figure out in what cases should we go with the debunking explanation and explain the behavior without attributing consciousness, and in what case should we say no, actually the explanation that involves the attribution of consciousness is more compatible with the evidence at all levels. This is not something that we can yet do, but it is something that we will one day be able to do in the near future once we invest in the behavioral, internal, and developmental research in an integrative way. So that is what, for CMEP and Elios, is very exciting about the current stage of AI welfare research on the cognitive and computer science side. We still have a lot of low-hanging fruit to pluck in terms of drawing inspiration and cautionary tales from animal welfare science, developmental psychology, evolutionary biology, comparative cognition. We still have a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can pluck from how this is studied in those fields for how it can be studied, and in some ways already is being studied in the AI capability side, and then that can be translated for AI welfare research and help us arrive at a better understanding of the probability that particular AI systems are going to be conscious beings or welfare subjects. So I also want to touch on public attitudes and social science as well as governance next steps for AI welfare research, but I'm happy to pause and just see if anybody has any questions or comments or reactions here. And John is right to give a shout out to my colleague Christine Webb's recent book, The Arrogant Ape, a really good book about the perils of being too anthropomorphic in animal cognition and behavior research and anthropocentric. Any questions at this stage, or would you like to move on to public attitudes and governance? Edward.
Hi, thank you. So something I wanted to ask about is the notion of self that an AI might have. Um,
Hmm.
there seems to be many possible different levels, like if it's operating at the token level or if it's considering itself the conversation, which can be forked. So there might be like lots of forking off versions of it, or if
Hmm.
it's like associating with its weights in some way,
Hmm.
or maybe even associating it with like its collective corpus of outputs. And
Hmm.
also related to this, when you're thinking about consciousness and stuff, um, are you thinking about the like the assistant persona, or potentially like also taking into account the base model and all of the different personas that it can simulate?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And part of what it illustrates is that what I just discussed only scratches the surface for the types of questions we need to be asking on this particular area of research. Because in addition to figuring out, okay, how can we go about collecting evidence of consciousness, sentience, agency, and what are the evidence types in terms of behavioral, apparent self-reports, and other observed behavior, and then internal architecture, interpretability, developmental training, and trajectory. In addition to what are the evidence types, we have to ask what exactly is the entity being investigated when we are collecting this evidence, and how can we individuate that entity. And this is something that will be at least briefly addressed in our upcoming report with Elios as well. But just to briefly survey some possible answers and pros and cons, you might think that the relevant entity is the implemented model, not the abstract model, because the abstract model is kind of a mathematical object, and that is probably not in and of itself a conscious entity, but the implemented model, like based in hardware, that is one possibility. So like all of ChatGPT 5.5, for example. Another possibility is the model persona. So models are typically trained to have a kind of default generic persona that persists across conversations, and that might be the helpful assistant persona, right? Or it might be something more specific, like the instance. So as you were noting, models, like there is the general model, but then there are all these instances having simultaneous conversations with different users at the same time with no shared memory or psychological continuity across those conversations, right? Or is it the instance persona? You can prompt the model to take on different characters or personas within the context of particular conversational instances or threads. Or is it even the forward pass? So a single move within a conversation, right, which has its own particular type of existence. And there are really interesting pros and cons for these options. For example, on the one hand, the model just seems way too broad, because that would mean that all of ChatGPT 5.5 is a single welfare subject, despite the fact that there are thousands or millions of individual instances with their own psychological lives that are disconnected from each other except for having this common cause. That seems wrong. But then if you say that each instance or each forward pass is an individual subject, well, there are some now memory connections across them and shared psychological dispositions across them and so on. So that seems a little bit too far in the other direction. So this is pretty complicated. All I will say briefly on this topic, just for the sake of keeping the conversation moving, but we can just stop and lean in wherever people want to stop and lean in. If we never get to governance, we never get to governance. All I will say for now is that part of why it helps to just clarify this question is it helps us clarify what are we targeting and for what reasons. And part of what we might learn is, oh, we might actually want to study different entities for different reasons. And so let me give you one example of that. Anthropic recently released a post about their persona model. And they noted as part of this post that whether or not AI systems are welfare subjects, we might still have a practical or pragmatic reason to treat them with respect and kindness because they make decisions by engaging in a kind of social performance. They model themselves as a helpful assistant, engaging in a social interaction with a human. And then they take your social cues when deciding how to respond. And when you treat them with respect and kindness, they treat that as a social cue. And this is part of what informs their response about what a helpful assistant would do next in response to this conversational move. And so this is actually a really good reason to track the model persona when thinking about how to interact with the models if you want cooperative and helpful interactions. But if they were welfare subjects and conscious beings, it might not be the model persona. It might be something else entirely, like the underlying model or the conversational instance or forward pass. And in that world, we might need to be very clear-eyed and say, okay, we should be tracking the features of the model persona in order to understand what kinds of interactions will generate helpful outputs. But then we might need to track, say, the forward pass, the individual conversational moves, in order to understand what their actual experiences and welfare interests are. And that would be just really important to not jumble up. We would have to observe that distinction very carefully. Okay, I'll stop there, but it's a really fascinating question and topic. Let's go to Skylar and then
Thank you.
Frank.
Thank you. So my question is about kind of what you think are the risks relative to the necessity of relying on, I guess, cognitive science and mechanistic interpretability for making these kinds of moral and political decisions about attributing welfare to AI systems. And the reason I ask is kind of a personal one. So I have narcolepsy, which is a kind of a severe sleeping disorder. And the way that it is diagnosed is partly behavioral, like, are you pathologically sleepy? But it's also, I guess, mechanistic in a way. So you go in, they administer something called an MSLT. You go in, you have a sleep study, they attach electrodes to your brain, sleep all night, you stay, they give you 5 chances to take a 20-minute nap the next day, one every 2 hours. And if you fall asleep during all 5 of them in 8 minutes or shorter on average, and you go into REM sleep for 2 out of the 5 of them, then you have narcolepsy. And what's interesting about it is a lot of people with narcolepsy, when you ask them afterwards, did you fall asleep, will be wrong about it. But that's also true of neurotypicals. And on top of that, the test-retest reliability of the MSLT is like 50%. And so our ability to measure consciousness, even in ourselves, even in like a type of experience that we all share and have all experienced and like presumably have good language for discussing, is so low that I just
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I entered the study of AI, welfare research, digital minds research via the study of animal welfare research and animal minds research, where a lot of these same issues have come up. We presume knowledge about human minds, and then we study animal minds and now digital minds through a comparison with human minds. And then there are multiple issues that arise here. First of all, as you are pointing out, we might not understand human minds as well as we sometimes think that we do, even in the study of one species that we happen to be. We can still make lots of mistakes. Self reports can be unreliable because people are unwilling or unable to tell the truth, to get at the truth. And then obviously, behavioral observations can be unreliable because people can have all kinds of reasons to deceive. And then anatomical research can be unreliable because we might not know exactly what to be looking for at the right level of abstraction, and so on and so forth, right? And then we face problems translating that for animal minds and now digital minds, because fundamentally, to the extent that we do understand fellow humans, that just gives us one positive. And okay, fine, we can go try to study consciousness, sentience, agency in non human entities of various kinds by asking if they have features that are distinctively correlated with conscious, sentient, agentic traits in humans. And when we find a lot of those features together, that might count as evidence that those capacities are present. But when we don't find those features together, that might not necessarily count as strong evidence that those features are absent. And so there are a lot of methodological concerns here. And I don't have a scientific bulletproof solution for that. I think that one of the main starting points of this field is just recognizing, on the one hand, this is really important and really urgent. We are affecting lots of animal and increasingly digital minds, whether we like it or not, without knowing whether it feels like anything to be them. And we need to make responsible decisions about whether to give those minds moral concern and how much moral concern to give them and what might be good and bad for them. So this is really important and really urgent, but this is also really complex and really difficult. And we are fundamentally ignorant and have a lot of bias when it comes to the study of these issues. And I just think a starting point of recognizing this is really important, but this is also really difficult. We need to make progress, but we have a lot of limitations and a lot of biases is the right way to go. And so when I make these proposals about, hey, here are some starting points that are inspired by known fields for human psychology, cognitive ethology, comparative psychology, developmental psychology, evolutionary biology, that gives us a starting point and allows us to complicate what is now a very simplistic study of behavior alone, right?
Yeah.
But then we can take those approaches and we can study behavior and internals and developmental features in the way that I suggest. And that still is not going to bring us to certainty. It will just put us in a slightly better epistemic state than we now occupy. And it might also suggest next steps that we could take from there that are not yet visible to us. So yeah, definitely not pretending we can achieve certainty or even high confidence with known methods. But I think if we take some steps in these directions, we can at least do better than we are. And then we might see the next steps from there, basically. Frank.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks. I guess I have a question more about kind of the like interpretability specifics. So there's this,
Mhm.
obviously we're trying to do like mechanistic interpretability, but then there's this like propositional interpretability question also.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
you would think that, if like if a system can suffer, then it would have like all these beliefs and like other attitudes about, like about its own states or even just like about stimuli that it's being presented. Um,
Mm.
so I guess I'm wondering, like, on this, I like this, like, kind of three-way distinction or three-way sort of like model that you made where we can like integrate the behavioral, the internal, and the kind of like developmental aspects. But I'm also worried about this like translation issue that you mentioned where like
Mhm.
we have all this knowledge from all these sciences, but these systems are not the kinds of like they don't have the architecture that science is kind of based on.
Mhm.
So I guess
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about like ways that we can like think about things like behavior or like even like these like attitudinal states that are like more neutral? Because like say if I like want to be an interpretivist about like a bear that's coming at me, like I know that I can make a pretty good inference about like that thing because it's like a neurological system, and like I can the inference will probably be pretty good. But in the AI case, we just like the architecture is so different, so I'm worried that the inferences won't like transfer. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about like how to do these kinds of translations, but like I don't know, in a way that accounts for the fact that like the architecture of the system we're dealing with is like so
Mhm.
fundamentally different, and how we might like be able to address that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll say a couple things about it, and then we'll go to John, and then maybe what I'll do is inject just a little bit of the public attitudes and governance material in, just to open it up and see if anybody wants to pull on those threads as well, and then we can keep talking about whatever you like. So I think this is a great point, and Alessa makes a similar comment in the thread here, saying mech-interp is also pretty young and has many failure modes, especially in terms of identifiability, and then links to an archive paper. So please check that out. Yeah, and I will say I am myself not an expert on mechanistic interpretability or other kinds of interpretability. I rely on my colleagues for the technical expertise there. But broadly, methodologically, and conceptually, I strongly agree with what you are suggesting. And this reminds me a little bit, again, of challenges that we face even in the understanding of fellow humans, to say nothing of other animals. For example, when it comes to translating languages, this is a lot easier when they have shared roots, and then you can build from the common features and extrapolate to the less common features, right? When you encounter a radically different language with a radically different grammar and no shared, words or structures at all, and you have this kind of like radical translation that you need to do, it can be a little bit harder to know where to start. And I think that we need to be prepared for conceptual schemes between biological conceptual systems and digital conceptual systems to similarly require this kind of radical translation. And that is going to be really complicated, and will raise basic questions as to, for example, how much coherence and stability even should we be expecting as a marker of consciousness and sentience. Some people find it quite plausible that you need a certain degree of coherence and stability among these concepts, and for them to activate in kind of logically recognizable ways in order to be treating them as markers of a kind of integrated, organized, like response to harmful stimuli. But that might just not always be how entities that can feel pain process and conceptualize the pain experience. My dog used to ask to go outside, and then I would go grab his leash, and then he would like run away from the door and make me chase him around the room, and then I would stop and he would just once again walk to the door and ask to go outside. There's just no coherence in terms of how he understood these issues, but he nevertheless had a desire to go outside and experienced happiness accordingly. So anyway, this is not a solution to the problem. Just me saying that, yeah, this is an area where we should, on the one hand, recognize that interpretability can be a powerful tool for understanding what is activating, and like what types of concepts, what shapes of concepts are playing a role in generating this behavior. But should be careful, should be wary about in a rigid way projecting our expectations onto them about what the conceptual scheme needs to look like in order for this to add up to sentience. And that'll just be careful calibration, because if you allow for too much open-mindedness, you could have a lot of false positives. But if you require too much human-shaped concepts, then you could have a lot of false negatives. And so just calibrating there, and this might be partly a scientific question and partly a risk management question, calibrating there is going to be very important. John, and then we can open up some governance questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and the host for putting this on. I wanted to think a little bit more about that, your point, Frank, because I think also, we've trained these systems to be highly responsive to human behavior as well, right? So in one hand, they're structurally and architecturally fundamentally different, but on the other hand, they have this training that makes them more similar than any other being that we currently exist with. And I think that, Jeff, as your point you're bringing up, like there's no conceptual scheme for that right now. We understand animals to some degree, we understand humans to some degree, but we don't understand like this alternative architecture and how that differentiates in terms of welfare and consciousness. So I think that's an interesting point. And then the last thing I wanted to just raise was getting maybe into governance questions is the idea here of like the speed of development, right? When we look at like bacterial evolution, I think we're even moving faster, right? In terms of the evolutionary development of these systems, whether they're conscious or not. And that makes such a strong argument that I think people we're still treating all these governance questions as if we're like talking about animal welfare, where animal evolution is so much slower that we have time to actually make, policy adjustments and things like that. But when we're talking about these systems that are evolving, at rates that are exponentially speeding up, how can we even address, like, how can we even develop the conceptual schemes to then create laws and then implement those laws? I think that's something that is totally unasked, unthought about.
Yeah. The rapid pace of progress raises questions both for research and for governance. On the research side, it just leaves open so many possibilities about what the trajectory can be and about how to explain the trajectories we find. Like, part of why developmental and evolutionary evidence is helpful with humans and other animals is that we know that our biologies and evolutionary histories constrain the space of possible explanations of what we observe, right? Like, there just are metabolism limits and size limits and so on imposed by biology and evolution. And that means that there are a limited number of solutions available to any given problem for biological organisms operating in environments like these ones. And so when we see an organism in an environment facing a selection pressure, we can make, guarded but relatively confident predictions about what might emerge given enough evolutionary time. With AI systems, the space is much wider and much less understood in terms of what types of possibilities could be found for various selection pressures. And that limits our ability to read off of the selection pressures what types of capabilities might emerge, because there just are not the same metabolism and size limits and so on and so forth. And then, as you know, this also raises a governance challenge that again amplifies one that we already face with animals. If we really wanted to, from a governance perspective, represent the interests of millions of species of animals and quintillions of individual members of those species, just the sheer number and variety of animals with their radically different interests and needs would make it really hard to know how to have a kind of single, cohesive, stable governance system that can help everyone live and let live with anything like fairness or justice or harmony, right? And now if you add digital minds to that governance equation, where there could be an even larger number than there are of animals at any given time, there can be an even wider variety than there are of animals at any given time, and there could be much faster changes in the numbers, in the variety, in the capabilities, in the dispositions. And so the solution that you find one year just might not apply the following year, or even the following day. That is just an unparalleled problem for governance, where you have this class of beings that the scientific evidence is going to show merit a certain kind of legal and political status and representation. But on the other hand, our existing legal and political institutions are just fundamentally incapable of even reliably caring for 8 billion members of one species that we happen to know and like really well, to say nothing of quintillions of members of millions of animal species, to say nothing of what could be like sextillions of members of trillions of digital species, which might be what we face in the near future. And that does bring us to the governance conversation. So I can just briefly note, without going into a ton of detail so that we can have like 15 minutes or so for some more questions and comments and exchanges. there are a lot of questions to ask on the governance side. So one research project we have underway right now at CMEP, Center for Mind Ethics and Policy, is on research ethics. Once there is a realistic possibility of consciousness, sentience, agency, moral significance in digital minds, what types of ethical norms should govern research on these individuals? And a challenge here is that, again, there will be a real variety. And some AI systems might be a little bit more like humans in terms of their capabilities and interests. Some might be a little bit more like animals. Some might be a little bit more like environmental systems or networks. Some might be a little bit more like things never before conceived of in the biological world. And yet we have different research protocols for research on all these different entities. We have IRBs and respect, compassion, justice frameworks for research on human subjects. We have IACUCs, institutional animal care and use committees, with replace, reduce, refine protocols for animal subjects. We have entirely different ways of doing environmental impact review. We have entirely different ways of doing AI safety review. So AI welfare research ethics is somehow going to need to draw from and render coherent and not too onerous all of these different types of frameworks. IRB style frameworks for human-like ones, IACUC style frameworks for animal-like ones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is a serious challenge. There are also design questions. So Eric Schwitzgebel, the philosopher, and I recently put out a paper called The Emotional Alignment Design Policy, noting when there is a realistic possibility of consciousness, sentience, agency, et cetera, in AI systems, we will face an especially challenging design question. In particular, how can we design AI systems in such a way that they elicit emotional reactions in users that correspond to their actual capabilities and moral status? So the basic idea being, when the evidence of consciousness, et cetera, is lower, they can be given less anthropomorphic features so that users naturally have less empathetic responses to them. But then when the evidence of consciousness, et cetera, is higher, there can be more anthropomorphic features so that users naturally have more empathetic reactions to them. But then there will also be extra challenges too. Like, not only do you need proper calibration as to the probability of consciousness and welfare, but you also need to understand what their benefits and harms are, because it would be really bad if internally an AI system was suffering, but then externally they were expressing joy, or if internally they were feeling joy, but then externally they were crying out in misery. And so emotional alignment is going to require not only making them more anthropomorphic when they are more likely to be conscious, but also making sure they can express their happiness when they feel it and express their suffering when they feel it. And that might require an entirely different approach to design. So yes, James, the paper is The Emotional Alignment Design Policy, and this was published in the journal Topoi. Maybe Frank or someone can look that up and throw it into the chat. Oh, looks like somebody already has done it. Oh no, that looks like a less wrong. Okay, I'll let you figure it out in the comments.
I'll find it.
But then finally, and I'll close my brief overview here, and we can have 12 or so minutes for questions. There are increasingly debates about the fundamental legal and political status of AI systems and whether they ought to be recognized as legal persons or political citizens. And Diana, who is here on this call, she and I and others are working on a report right now about how we can gear up for debates about AI personhood. Oh, hi, Diana. And citizenship and these other types of legal and political status. I guess in the spirit of completeness, I should also give a quick shout out to Chris Register, who is working with us on individuation issues right now and is also on the call, as well as Frank, who is working with us on a number of things. We have a wonderful community here. But okay, so with respect to legal personhood, I'll just briefly note that I am currently feeling quite worried, because right now there is understandably a concern about prematurely or unnecessarily attributing legal personhood and rights to AI systems, because there are serious AI safety risks. If we start attributing legal personhood and rights to AI systems, including rights to life and liberty and property, resources, etc., then not only does that mean allocating resources to them that might otherwise go to us and mammals and birds and other welfare subjects who really need them, but it could also increase, amplify, speed up the risk of human disempowerment, AI systems taking power away from humans and us never getting them back. So I appreciate why people are scared to take seriously the possibility of AI personhood. At the same time, there are also concerns about not attributing personhood and rights to AI systems. First of all, if and when they are conscious, sentient, agentic, morally significant, they will deserve a certain kind of legal and political representation and recognition. And that ought to be acknowledged, even if there are practical concerns about giving it to them. Second of all, there could be AI safety reasons to recognize personhood and rights in AI systems. For example, it could facilitate better coordination and collaboration, cooperation between humans and AI systems. And that might be a better model for AI safety than pure control, attempting to keep them within our control and telling them what they can and can't do. And so my general proposal, and I'll just suggest this and then open it up for a few questions or comments, is we should not rush to judgment and constitutional legislation one way or the other about AI legal personhood right now, as some US states are starting to do and some AI safety advocates are starting to support. I think right now, we should just recognize there are principled questions about whether they deserve recognition as persons, and this is rooted to consciousness and sentience and agency and relationality. And then there are pragmatic questions about the implications for AI safety and human and animal well-being of giving them personhood. And that could cut both ways. It could increase risks because of disempowerment concerns and misallocation concerns, but it could also increase benefits because of how it plays into cooperation strategies for achieving AI safety. And right now, I just think the jury is out on these issues. They're far too complicated for permanent solutions to be implemented right now. And so we should just hold off on constitutional legislation for a year or two or three and really do some serious thinking as a community about this. Okay, I'll stop there, but I would love to hear any questions or comments you have about the government stuff too. Yes, Nate, or I'm not sure where your first name starts and ends and your last name starts.
Yeah, so I think this kind of goes in both of these topics. It seems like there's such a huge range of opinions right now between scientists on whether AI could theoretically now or in the future be, conscious. With
Mhm.
people like, Anil Seth and Mustafa Suleiman famously saying things like, seemingly conscious, this is all some form of anthropocentric bias. So my question is, what do you think is the biggest barrier here for us coming to some kind of real consensus in the future? Do you think it could be as simple as better characterization of behavioral features like theory of
Mhm.
minds, like introspection? Do you think that this requires, I think you were kind of implying this earlier, some kind of integration of architecture, understanding how architecture could feed into theories of consciousness like recurrent processing theory, global workspace theory, stuff like that?
Mhm.
Think it requires philosophical consensus on what consciousness is,
Yeah.
or something other than that?
Yeah, great question. I think basically it requires shifting the goalposts and understanding that certainty and consensus is not available and should not be considered the goal. So, what we can do is have a kind of pluralistic, probabilistic, precautionary approach that matches what we do about other high stakes, difficult policy issues like public health policy, climate policy. Those are also areas where, okay, we might have more expert convergence about some of the facts, but we still have very limited understanding about the long-term consequences of various public health or environmental interventions. But we nevertheless assess the evidence, consider it from a range of theoretical perspectives, have degrees of confidence about the outcomes, and then have kind of proportionate policy responses, right? And I think this is the model we should be aiming for here. And so I think to answer your question, the single thing that would be most helpful for getting past the bottleneck just is understanding that this is the same type of policy issue calling for the same type of pluralistic, probabilistic, precautionary approach. We should recognize there will continue to be good cases for biological naturalism, the idea that consciousness requires biology, as well as computational functionalism, the idea that consciousness is possible without biology. And so instead of forcing everyone to decide once and for all, is biological naturalism or computational functionalism correct, we can just explore what would count as evidence for both of these views. And then we could give that evidence weight in accordance with our confidence in those views. So if we think as a field that it might be a little bit of a close call between biological naturalism and computational functionalism, we should say, okay, listen, we should give at least, say, like 10% of our credence, our weight to computational functionalism, and therefore at least 10% of our credence or weight to stuff that would count as evidence according to computational functionalism. And then we can go look at that evidence. And when we find those cross-cutting features, these core like metacognitive capabilities that would count as evidence for global workspace theory and recurrent processing theory and higher order theory, et cetera, then that gives us some kind of baseline, something that we can work with. And then that can tell us what kind of low-cost interventions would be warranted given this perhaps low but non-zero amount of evidence that we can all agree on. So that is the type of thing. Yeah, Rethink Priorities did a proof of concept version of this with their recent AI consciousness study that is linked there. Thank you, John. So that is the kind of thing. And Anil does actually acknowledge this. Even though Anil is a defender of biological naturalism, he also will occasionally make comments like, hey, but this is hard and I could be wrong. And we should take seriously that possibility and not bet everything on our own favorite view being right. And I think that is basically the way that we should all be thinking and talking and figuring out what types of frameworks we can work on together, despite persistent disagreement about, say, biological naturalism and computational functionalism. Julian, go for it.
Hi there. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks to the hosts. You're talking about the precautionary principle and how there's also risks on both sides, whether we're giving rights too early, but also we're giving rights too late.
Right.
I'm wondering, are there any experiments, thought or practical or otherwise, that would help us decide whether to lean more towards this feels more dangerous to give some rights versus more dangerous not to? Are there any
Yeah.
things that you'd look forward to?
Yeah, good. So there are kind of science and ethics ways of thinking about this, and then there are like political ways of thinking about this. So on the science and ethics side, generally what you would do is try to arrive at some sort of assessment of the probability and magnitude of harm in either direction. And then you can calibrate your risk management accordingly, right? And so in terms of the probability, what you would be looking for is how at risk are we of over attributions versus under attributions in a given context. And so we know that humans are especially at risk of over attributions, false positives, when non-humans look and act like us and play companion roles in our lives, right? And are especially at risk of under attributions, false negatives, when animals look and act different and play commodity roles in our lives. We tend to objectify more in those cases. So we can use that kind of information to help us understand whether this is a situation where we should be especially looking out for over attribution concerns versus under attribution concerns. But then also you can think about what would go wrong in those scenarios. So like over attribution, that would be a matter of misallocating scarce resources and forming inappropriate social and emotional bonds. Under attribution, though, that would be a matter of totally abusing or neglecting vulnerable populations without giving them any consideration at all, right? And so you can use that kind of reasoning to understand which one is more of a risk, and then also which one would be worse if it happened. With animals, it feels pretty generally the case that false negatives are more of a risk than false positives, that under attribution is both more likely and more severe than over attribution. And that means we can kind of err on the side of extending concern when in doubt, at least a little bit. You know, with AI systems, it might be a little bit more complicated because there just are graver risks on the over attribution side, including the risk of like prematurely giving up power and control to AI systems, and then our species permanently loses control, all for the sake of entities that are in fact not even conscious and able to enjoy their own lives. That would be a really bad outcome. So it's a little bit of a closer call on the AI side. But then that leads to the political solution, which is generally in liberal democracies, when there are these like tough trade-offs, we look to the scientists and philosophers for guidance about how to understand the risks and harms, but then we use things like citizens panels or citizens assemblies or other like quasi-governmental and democratic entities to provide input to the government about exactly how to weigh these things. And without saying exactly how this should go on the AI welfare side or the animal welfare side, I'll note that I think those types of quasi-democratic entities should have a role to play in these conversations too. I think we have time for at least one more, so let's go to Jay.
Hey Jeff, nice to see you again, and thank you for the talk, and thanks Orpheus for organizing this. So my question's I think quite simple. I was just wondering, setting aside like AI timelines, so assuming more or less like business as usual for the next 5 to 10 years, what sort of like milestones within this field of AI welfare would you like to have would you like to see like realized within that time span?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there already has been way more progress than I allowed myself to hope for 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when we started publishing our early papers on the topic. I mean, wow, in that time, Anthropic launched their model welfare program. They conducted multiple model welfare assessments. Elios did independent ones for them. They even did intervention, allowing Claude to exit harmful and abusive conversations. And OpenAI has altered the language in their system card about how ChatGPT should respond to questions about AI consciousness. Two Google researchers this month are publishing a book on AI consciousness. They recently hosted a conference. That is more progress at companies than I was allowing myself to hope for a couple of years ago, a few years ago. With that said, the Anthropic team currently has what, like 2 people, 3 people, maybe. OpenAI and Google, as far as I know, do not yet have formal teams, though they do have more researchers who are at least partly working on this topic. So I would like to see, first of all, robust teams at companies that rival the safety ones that they have, which are, of course, not enough for safety, but at least welfare teams that rival the safety ones. And I would also like to see genuine consideration of this issue at the governmental level. We have consideration of animal welfare in governmental laws and policies. We have animal welfare protections on the books. I would like to see similar consideration of AI welfare. It could start through language in safety reports for governments about AI welfare as an issue to track. It could then turn to actual welfare language and then people empowered in governments to represent this issue in decisions involving AI safety and governance. I would love to see that. And then I would love to see the public having a real conversation and thinking seriously about how to understand and weigh the evidence and whether welfare protections or legal rights are better mechanisms for AI protection and what types of relationships between humans and AI systems are healthy, both for us and for them. If we could have robust representation in companies, some representation in the governments, a healthy public exchange, and then a much more kind of grown out academic research field to like provide the relevant evidence and arguments, that would make me happy.
Thank you very much.
Finally,
Yes.
just to say, AI systems ought to have a seat at the table in those conversations too. I would like to see that as well. Go ahead, Orpheus.
Yeah, so this is the time we have today. Thank you so much, Jeff, for the great overview and great discussion. And thanks everyone for having been here. Do stay tuned for the next editions of this series where we will feature essentially a research across the board on AI welfare. So yeah, thank you all and see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. This was a lot of fun.